This is Lecture 1 on Federalism and the Division of Powers in the United States government. Now, federalism is a system of government in which the power is divided between a central government and regional governments. There are many ways that you could do that, and basically each government will decide how they're going to organize that balance of power between levels. In a unitary system, what we started with in England, of course, all the power was held at the national level, and the constituent units, whether those were territories or colonies or regions of the country, don't really have much power. So we rejected that and set up a confederation. In a confederation, the states have more power than the central government. We found that to be unworkable because the states didn't comply with many things that were really necessary for the good of the nation as a whole. And so our system came up with this combination of the two, essentially, of sort of the best parts of a unitary system and the best parts of a confederal system to come up with this blending of systems that we call federalism. Now this chart shows you, and you might want to pause it and look at it because I'm just going to go really fast on charts, but it shows you in a democratic system what the role is of the central government, the state governments, and the citizens in all three types, unitary, confederate, and federal. Obviously, if it's not a democratic system in some type, you would take citizens out of this chart. So take a moment, look at this, and make sure you understand it. This chart shows in the United States how we have one national government, 50 state governments, and then we have thousands and thousands of lower levels of government. It's important to note that the U.S. Constitution really only sets up two levels. It sets up the national level and the state level. And then it's up to the states if they want to further subdivide down. And we have subdivided like crazy in the United States. There are 89,527 different units of government in the United States as of 2010. That can be an advantage or a disadvantage. We'll look at that in a later lecture. But keep this in mind as you move on. The Constitution sets up two, then states have the decision to further subdivide, and they also have the decision on whether when they do subdivide, assuming they do they want to give any real authority to those subunits or not? Alabama is a state that really doesn't give much in the way of authority to those subunits, and if they do give authority, that is something that is called home rule. In Alabama, we don't give much home rule. So the state government makes decisions, and then they tell the cities and the counties how to administer those decisions for the most part. That differs from state to state, which is very possible in this federalist system. So let's look at the specific kinds of powers that are granted to each level of government. First, the federal government has 5 types of powers. Some of these should be somewhat self-explanatory. But the express powers are also called the enumerated powers, meaning that they've been specifically listed. This chart right here shows an example of how powers have been enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, which deals with Congress. So these are specific things that the national government can do. They also have powers delegated to them, meaning granted to them. That's really sort of another way, it's more of an umbrella way of looking at expressed powers. Powers can be implied, and in our Constitution, powers are implied through the inclusion of what's called the elastic clause, right there in Article 1, Section 8, where it says Congress shall have powers to do all things necessary and proper to stretch these powers. So those are not specifically stated, but they are implied in the language. And then there's inherent powers. Now, these can be a little confusing to a student of American government. Inherent powers are defined as powers that governments have just by virtue of being a government. So basically, it's the powers that governments need in order to fulfill those purposes of government that we looked at in the first unit. To create courts, to provide public services, create economic systems, make relationships with other countries, control immigration. Those are things that we think of as inherent powers. We're real fixated on legalism in the United States, and so for us it's important to specifically state all powers. And so we have listed the inherent powers within the expressed powers. So there aren't specific inherent powers not listed in our Constitution because we thought it was important to write them all down. In other countries, they may not write those things down. And then, of course, powers that the national government holds exclusive to others are powers that national governments need inherently, things like making the currency, regulating immigration, making war and peace, those kinds of things. The powers that the states hold are called reserved powers, and that's because in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, it says that all powers not granted to the national government or denied to the states are reserved to the states. And the idea was that the national government only had the powers they were granted specifically, and the states held everything else. Now, what about powers that are held by everybody? Okay, these are called concurrent powers. Concurrent means at the same time. So these are powers held by all levels of government. There are 5 listed. The first 3 really pretty much go together. Okay, for government to fulfill those powers and duties and responsibilities of government, for instance, providing public services, well, they need resources to do so. In a communist system, an autocratic system, they might just seize and control all the resources. In our Republican form of government, with a democracy, the people control resources, and so the government has to tax us to get them. And of course, the reason they tax is to spend it. That sometimes moves to borrowing because of the central nature of taxing and spending. Taxes come in over a period of time. Spending needs are usually immediate. So what do you do when your money's not going to be there yet, but you need to spend it now? Well, you borrow. How governments borrow, governments don't go to the bank like you and I might and ask for a loan. Governments issue bonds. Okay? Bonds are a pretty low risk, low interest rate investment, but they're usually a pretty safe investment. The ones you might be most familiar with would include like savings bonds. Maybe your grandparents bought those for you when you were a child. And they mature over time. City municipal bonds do the same thing, and you may have studied this in economics. So the city would issue bonds, investors would purchase them. That gives the government money to spend now on the services or the things that their citizens need. And then as the tax revenue comes in, they invest it in higher risk investments that'll earn a greater rate of interest to then pay back the bonds on maturity later. Okay, that's a real simplistic version of how those 3 fall together. Another power that all levels of government share are what are called the police powers. The police powers are the powers to make laws, enforce the laws, and interpret the laws. So in other words, to set up those 3 branches and operate them. Okay, so you have national government that includes a Congress and the president and the courts. You have state governments that include your governors, your state legislatures, and your courts. And then even at the city level, you have mayors and city councils or county commissions and municipal courts as well. Now, national government legislative laws and state legislative laws, those hold more power, and those are called statutes. Okay, statutes are about laws that affect all the citizens of a country or a state. They are generally divided into categories like felonies and misdemeanors, and so they have more serious consequences. It may include jail time, fines, etc. Cities deal with what are called ordinances. Ordinances are laws passed by municipalities, and they are minor in nature. They don't deal with this. Okay? Instead, they are usually something where you won't get jail time unless there's an escalation. You keep committing the same violation or something. But they deal with things like leash laws, noise ordinances, curfews, those kinds of things, and are very individualistic to the municipalities in question. And then the last of these powers is the power of eminent domain. Now, eminent domain is the power of the government to take your property for public usage. And the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution says that if the government takes your property to use it for a road, a park, a school, an airport, those kinds of things, then they have to compensate you, but they can take it. All right? Now, initially, the Constitution applied just to the national government, And so the interpretation was the national government, if they took land, had to compensate you. But there really was no interpretation about the states unless state constitutions protected you. That will change over time. And really today it is your state and local governments that seize property, not the national government, though you are protected by all. The level to which you are protected will vary from state to state. There's a nice level 1 activity where you would watch a video that I have. It's on CD, or on DVD, excuse me. And it deals with this issue of the takings clause. How does state government and local government take your property? Is it really for public usage, or is it for profit of local leaders or local government? If that concept interests you, you might want to do that level 1 activity on an eminent domain. Now, there's not very many things in the Constitution that are denied, and that's because, as I mentioned before, the Constitution is one of saying you can only do this. So there's not too many things that they tell you you can't do. I'm not going to talk about this very much for that reason, other than just to say that if powers are denied to one level of government, it's usually because it's a power that belongs to another level of government. There's a great chart at the very end of this lecture that you can pause and look at. I'm limited on the amount of time I can record on this app, so that's why I'm rushing so fast. But take a moment and look at that chart at the end when you get there. Here is another good graphic. This is called an infographic, and it divides up and shows you some examples of things that each level of government can do and shows you the overlap of concurrent powers. I would also suggest that you pause the video here and really look at this chart. This can give you some good examples of things that each level of government can do and what they share, and be something that we could talk about in an interview. Now, there's a clip in the video, or in Moodle, for you to watch called The Roots of Federalism. And in your notes, I would like you to answer these 3 questions. So pause this video, write these questions down, and then when you finish this lecture, watch the Roots of Federalism video and answer those questions, and they will help you better understand the relationship about powers in the United States system. So why is federalism so important? Well, for one thing, because it decentralizes our politics. Remember, in the first unit we defined politics as the art of governing. In a unitary system, all decisions are made at one level, and so it's easy for one group or one political party, one ideology to make all the decisions and impose it on everyone. In federalism, since you have so many levels of government, remember there were like 87,000 different governments in the United States, it's harder for one group to control everything. That's an advantage. It also decentralizes our policies because federal and state governments have different powers and they handle different kinds of problems. And so that allows for innovation in the states. It allows for things to be handled in a way that local values can be met rather than nationalizing every situation. And there's a number of lessons that talk about this as well as a later lecture. Now, the founders anticipated some problems with this potentially because of problems that occurred while the states really held more power under the Confederation. And so they put in the supremacy clause. And they said that the national will be supreme. That's in Article 6. Yet, they also said that the national government can't take away and do the things that states are responsible for. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a later lecture, but make sure you jot down these facts. Finally, here is that chart that shows you powers granted and powers denied to each level or concurrently in our government. Take some time, pause, and look at this. I think this is some good examples for an earlier slide for you so you know what each level of government can do and what they absolutely cannot do. Come to me if you have questions on the meaning of any of these. And then finally, here's your what do you think slide. These are some questions to answer, to think about. Pause it and write them down, and then if you decide to meet with me and discuss the lecture, these are some things that we can talk about. These are opinion-based for the most part, with some factual knowledge mixed in, so don't get intimidated by it. I look forward to talking with each of you.